It's my pleasure to introduce Chia-Ming Ro, class of '04. Chia-Ming majored in economics accounting at CMC. After graduating, she went into audit and shortly thereafter, not shortly thereafter, but eventually became where she currently is, the finance director at Yucatan Media. She is also a full-time gardening consultant, and in that capacity, she's here with us today. She lives in El Segundo, California. And just so everyone is aware, and I know Jenna will put this in the chat as well, her website is coastalhomestead.com, and Instagram, where she's very active, and I recommend you following her on Instagram, is coastal_homestead. Chia-Ming, thank you for being with us today. Thanks for taking your time, and we're very excited to hear your presentation. Don't forget to unmute there.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. Sorry about that. Thank you everyone for being here. My extended Claremont family. I actually knew Evan because I was 04, and also I see Mike on. He was 07 after, so it's nice to see those faces. And Susan, I think I went to New York and visited you at the law firm with the 4+1 program. So this is like super exciting for me. Anyway, so most of you are probably going to say, how did you go from econ accounting all the way to gardening? Like, where does that even start? And is there even a program? Like, how do you even do this, right? And so I want to take you back to March 16th, at least for LA in 2020, right? That happens to be my birthday, but also the first day of quarantine in LA, right? So I know everyone saw the panic buying, and they waited in line for 45 minutes just to come into the grocery store with empty shelves. And that's when a light bulb went off where I said, I need to do something. And I don't think you're part of the Claremont family without feeling this pull of, I need to give back, I need to do more, right? And so for me, it took me a couple months, but by July of 2020, I launched Coastal Homestead. And the reason behind that is because it is my one-person mission to solve for food security. I can't do it for the whole world, but I can do it for one person at a time within my community. And I truly believe that people need to grow food and to learn that after learning how to walk, how to talk, and even how to eat solids. So I try to teach families and children and the like. So I do have a little presentation pulled up. I do have a second screen, so if I'm not looking right at you, I'm just glancing over at the screen. So I'll do that. And so today I think we have some inexperienced to some very experienced people. So today's presentation is going to be a bit more about how I like to teach my clients on not to rabbit hole down into like the back of the seed packet of, oh, I can't do this. And if I want to grow 10 different varieties, all of a sudden you're down this rabbit hole and you just want to quit, right? So this is what I'm trying to avoid and help you kind of wrap your brain around how to approach the garden. And we're going to focus a little bit more on winter just because that's the season that we're about to be in for gardening. All right, let me share real quick. Here you go. All right, so it's how to create your own venturing into gardening in 2020. So here's what to expect. I kind of give you my little story a little bit. Then we're going to talk about one thing you need to succeed in the garden, and it's not going to be what you think. And we're going to talk about where to start, what you need, the way to think about the sun, the water, and the soil. And then kind of my philosophies of how to start with seed versus seedling, then the winter garden, and then next steps. So I told you a little bit about that. And I guess the tagline is Coastal Homestead is a gardening consultancy that teaches the ritual of gardening through a modern lens. These days, nobody has the time to spend hours and hours, even if you're retired and you have no day job, you still don't have that time because life is just so busy now. So I want to try to simplify and get the gardener back into the garden without all the complication and all the noise. So, and I do want to encourage everyone to grow because right now, during the pandemic, we are so separated. The only way to connect is through virtual right now, right? What we're doing right now, that is all we have to be safe. And you know, in my Instagram community, I've connected with so many gardeners, and I'm getting honey from somebody else, and I'm giving microgreens. After this call, I'm dropping microgreens off to somebody else. So I feel like this is like the modern victory garden, right? So we all can grow our own, and then we can learn and teach each other. And there's an element, I won't go over composting today, but there's an element of, if you go to the store and you don't manage to finish everything that you've stockpiled, where does that go? Is it in the trash, or can you put it back into your garden and it comes back around and feeds you, which I truly, really appreciate. And I don't know, there's just like a tiny snippet of that. I don't know if you know, you could actually take your dryer lint if you have mostly cotton-based clothing, and that can go into your compost bin. So it's that future of like what we can do individually for our world. And obviously with food security and the pandemic, and with all of the food supply chains being disruptive, people not being able to work at the factories due to COVID restrictions or things like that, I think if you know how to grow your own crop, you know you won't starve. Maybe you won't love eating carrots for a month, but you will not starve, right? And with that, you have something to trade, and your family will learn and be able to carry that on further and further. And again, I kind of briefly touched upon it, but for me, I grew up growing Asian greens because we couldn't get to that when we first came to the US when I was 3. We didn't have a lot of money, but my mom always grew in whatever patch of dirt she found. And so it's kind of like ingrained in me for that gardening. And to be honest, I feel like, I mean, there's no scientific thing that says this, but what happened before the grocery store? Where did we get our food? From farmers. So if we go far back enough, if each one of us went back far enough, I'm sure we're all related to at least one farmer, one green thumb. So I truly believe everybody has it in them. We just have to find that perfect plant or setup for you that works. So then this is what the one thing that I think everybody needs, and this community has no issue with, because that's what Claremont fosters, is the love for learning. Now, even if you're for all of my like super experienced gardeners on the call right now, you know that every season there is a new challenge. But those who do love it, continue, because we love that challenge and we want to learn more and new varieties, right? But for the budding brand new gardener, that's a lot to take on. So that's what the next few pages, I'm hoping to help alleviate some of that overwhelm. So this is like my sun rules that I kind of like to distill down. They are not precise to a very specific variety or anything like that. And I do this because if you also go all the way back, before there was writing, before there was print, what did they do? They read the sun. They looked at the plants. They didn't read the back of a packet or a book or watch somebody on YouTube to tell them how to grow something, right? So in general, if you take something and you say, I want to eat this, what part of it are you eating, right? So if it's lettuce, it's the leaf. And that's going to be 4 to 6 hours of sun that you need as a general rule of thumb. Now, if you want to grow carrots or beets or radishes, then you're going to need 6 to 8 hours. And if you think about it, I want you to like get away from the nitty gritty and think about, okay, if I'm going to eat this, how hard is it for this plant to create the leaf? Okay, and how hard is it for the plant to create the root or the actual fruit, which would be, you know, sometimes a cucumber, even though, you know, different vegetables we call the debate between, is it a vegetable or a fruit, right? So depending on the item that you're eating off of the plant, how big is it? The larger means more sun. And same thing with fruit trees, you're gonna want full sun. So then it leads to the question about, well, I only have a spot for shade. Can I grow anything in shade? Well, the answer is you can try. You can always try. And that's what I try to teach my clients is you won't know if it works or not until you try. You can ask any other person, but they don't have that plot and they don't know. And you do. And you have that ability to go and try something. Now, in the shade, what you can try is herbs. Those are probably the most friendly to that. I mean, I should preface that I am mostly talking about edible things today. I'm not really talking about the shade flowers or the shade plants. Yes, you can have a beautiful shade garden, but you can't really eat that. And that's not part of my mission. So, but the herbs, you can definitely do it. And if you have some part sun and it's like dappled sun, then you could probably go with any of the leafy greens as well. So that is the sun. And if you have any questions, definitely post it in the chat. I will take a look at it and answer them. Now back to water. This is one of the #1 questions I get is how much do I water? The answer is, I don't know. I can't tell you. I can give you general rules, but I can't tell you because I'm not where you are. I don't know what you put into the planter or the pot, and I don't know what plant it is. You could tell me, but certain varieties, they need different, right? So what I like to teach is how to read the signs of the plant. Now, if the plant, the leaves are starting to droop, it needs water. And most plants, you can always say don't overwater. Well, what does that even mean, right? Like you hear that all the time, don't overwater, don't underwater. Well, what does that mean? So when you overwater, you get a soggy bottom. And I try to say, well, nobody likes soggy feet. You know, you go down Splash Mountain and you're wet all day. Don't do that, right? And also when you're watering, you want to do it if you can get out there. The best thing, if you have a morning cup of coffee or tea, take it outside, get your fresh air and water at that point in time. Because same thing, if you've ever been on Splash Mountain, you want to hit that ride during the day when the sun will help you dry off and not at the end of the day, right? Because you're going to be cold, you're going to be miserable. The same thing with plants. So with watering, I always try to say, if it's during the summer, most likely you're going to do an everyday thing, especially here in Southern California. Now, if it's in the winter like we are right now, you're probably better off with like an every other day. But at the same time, if you're starting seedlings, which we'll cover more later, you don't want to let anything dry out. And if you let it dry out, ants can move in. And we like ants. Ants are good insects for aeration, but you don't want them to take over. And then if you have like too little, then the roots start to struggle a little bit. And when the plant struggles, then it's like a person's has a cold, right? That's when the pests come. That's when the mildew sets in. So that's why watering, you really need to read the signs of the plant and then also check the soil. One thing I like to do is actually those takeout chopsticks that you get from the Chinese restaurant when you're ordering out, and you stick it in, or you could use like a toothpick or a kebab stick, just a piece of wood, pencil tip, stick it in about 1 inch or 2. And if it comes out dry, then it's definitely time to water. And if it comes, it's just like when you're baking, you check for doneness of the cake. So then we talk about soil. Now, soil is made out of clay, sand, and silt, and that is your native soil. But when it comes to growing for food, you need a really good mix, and that's going to be 40% clay. Oh, sorry, you're going to want to, 40% clay, 40% sand, and silt for 20%. And you can see the reasons on my screen. But that is really hard to get to in your native soil. And it costs a lot of money to amend your native soil. Native soil meaning the soil that's in the ground on your property or wherever you want to grow. So if your decision to grow right now, and you don't want to wait to amend, because amending soil can take years and years of composting and getting worms in there, then the best thing to do is do a raised bed or container gardening where you have full control over that soil. You know where it's coming from, you know the composition. And you know, some of my favorite things to use are, you're going to use a raised bed mix. You're going to have compost in there. I use marine-based fertilizers and worm castings. So then basically, I think of it kind of like a multivitamin for my raised bed. And I think there's going to be questions about pests and mildew and, you know, fungus and things like that. And what I try to teach is your soil is where you want to invest your money, because that is the best thing you can provide for your plants. Rarely do I ever see in, you know, on YouTube or on a lot of the content that says to focus on the soil. Most of it is on the plant itself. But if you can get the soil composition right, and if you can make it very nutrient and it has good drainage, that's what's setting you up for success. Let's see. Okay, now I know we're going a little bit fast, but I want to make sure I have plenty of time for all the questions. And I think that's where a lot of the benefit will come to for you guys. So seeds versus seedlings. If you're just starting out, I really recommend going with seedlings because there's so many challenges along the way when you're starting from seed. And some of it might not even be your fault. So when the seed companies harvest their seeds and prepare them for packaging, on some seed companies' packages, they will tell you there's a germination rate. Not everything in that seed packet is supposed to sprout. And if you happen to pick up one that's a little bit older or wasn't stored properly at the store, there's a chance it wasn't even your fault and it didn't germinate. And also, if you start from seed, I think in today's society, we are so conditioned to not wait, right? We Amazon things, we want things quickly. Amazon has conditioned us that if we don't get it in 2 days, where is it? Like, and to not pay for that too, right? So that's what gardening does for me personally, is it reminds me that life is not at that pace and we do need to slow down and to appreciate what nature has for us. And so, but if you start with a seedling, for example, that kind of is almost like the Amazon approach where you bought it, you didn't have to nurture it from a baby, and now you have it and you can sometimes start harvesting right away if it's a lettuce. Because with the lettuce, it goes like this, right? You have all the leaves and you think of that head of lettuce. When you plant it, you actually harvest from the outside, and the lettuce will continue growing and pushing out more leaves from the middle and out like this. So the seedlings are a way to quickly gain confidence, and then maybe in another season, you feel like you have enough knowledge to go and continue and grow something else. Now, the only exception to that, there are some things that you don't want to do from seedling. That's because they don't like their roots to be disturbed. And so when you have them in those little plastic containers that it comes in from the nursery, when you pop them out, sometimes it just gets disturbed and there's transplant shock. And there's things to avoid, but it's just easier if you start these direct, and it's called direct sowing. And so it's cucumbers, melons, peas, beans, and any of those root vegetables. And then, okay, so for the winter garden, this is mostly for the places that don't actually have a true winter, that like Southern California. And it's going to be the places that don't have snow or frost, unless you have a cover. You can get around it with having a cover. So things to grow are going to be beets, spinach, and Swiss chard. And you have all the different lettuces. Basically, your leafy greens right now are perfect. They are more cold resistant and they grow beautifully at this time. Now, the brassicas are, you know, the broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, collard greens. All these things are what we can eat seasonally right now. Now, certain ones are much bigger, like the broccoli, that little head that you get from the store, the actual plant is probably about 2 to 3 feet wide, like once it's to form that full head. So it takes time. The fastest ones on this list are probably going to be your radishes and your leafy greens, and kale and collards maybe, but the rest will take some time. And of course, herbs, cilantro, chives, mint, rosemary, sage, and thyme are great right now. Cilantro grows well cooler season, and you don't see basil on here because basil doesn't like it very cold. Even though our nights don't really dip below 50, that's still a bit cold for the basil, especially because it's going, like today, I think we were almost 78 out here in El Segundo. So it didn't make any sense. It hit that high and then the lows. The basil is just not that hardy for it. Okay, so we talked about winter, but let's say you're not ready to dig in, or it's just not for you right this moment. Winter technically starts, December 21st, but in order to prepare for the next season, you really want to start the season before. So let's talk about spring and what that planning looks like for your spring garden. So you probably want to talk to somebody or do your research and design what you want in January. This is what I plan for my clients. Then in January and February, that's probably when you're going to set up your garden or you're going to plant it. And for those of you who already have a garden, this is a perfect time to amend your soil, to add more compost and just really build that soil up. And I would even use like cover crop or just grow some leafy greens to just replenish that soil in preparation for spring sowing. And then in March, that's when you would really probably start planting all of the plants for the spring. And then in March through May, you'll be able to harvest. And then again, the cycle comes back around. So, things that you can grow for spring are going to be, you can still do your leafy vegetables. You can probably start some tomatoes. I have this entire big basket of seeds that I still have not put away. You can see all my seeds. I collect quite a few for my own garden and others, but spring is a good time for, let's see what else there are. You can start your bell peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that, especially for the LA region. That's when things start to warm up. And the most important part too is that we don't really dip too cold. A lot of seedlings don't like it too cold. So let's see. And then that's kind of my really quick run through of a surface level. This is how to think about gardening. And I have plenty of time now for Q&A. So let me stop sharing. Oh, so here is my email. I think Jenna and Evan have put it into the chat as well, and my Instagram where you can follow along. So there we go.
Great. Thank you, ChiaMing.
You're welcome.
A few people have already submitted questions via email, which is always great. And I'm going to kick it off with a question of my own. It's about growing watermelon.
Okay.
I tried to grow watermelon the last go around. And I feel like the branches, it kept growing and growing. It grew all over the place, but I never got any watermelon.
Did you see flowers?
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
Which
so
would also give me no watermelon, but.
So the thing with melon, for example, watermelon, melon. So the thing is you need to have flowers, obviously, right? And so when I hear something like that, where you didn't see flowers, then I would think that maybe your nutrients were imbalanced. If it had a lot of greens, like a lot of the plant, the green leaves and everything, then that has like potentially excess of nitrogen. So when you're talking about gardening, it's like N, P, and K. So I think that's phosphorus and potassium are the other two. And you need the other two for roots and flowering to keep it like high level. So when I hear that, I think you probably need a little bit more phosphorus or potassium to encourage flowering. Now, if you did see flowering, then I would ask you, did you see bees or butterflies? Because then you need the pollination of the flower to then create the fruit. So the watermelon that you pick up at the grocery store, it really started a long time ago, you know? And so it needs to go through all those stages of flowering and then pollination and then fruiting and then surviving all the way to transport to get to you. So that's what I would think to try out.
That would make sense. All right. We have a question from Rebecca about compost. How would you go about starting, I'm assuming Rebecca does not compost currently. How do you start your own compost, and how long does it usually take before you can start using said compost?
Okay, so I'm gonna try to keep this like the nutshell version, because compost is an entire other like 5 webinars, okay? So compost, there's basically, you can break it down into 3 different ways. There's your traditional compost, where I wouldn't recommend this unless you have the space and the time, because traditional compost is you have your big bin or a pile somewhere and you just layered it on, and you need, we call it browns and greens. Browns are going to be your dead things like leaves, cardboard, paper goods, things like that. Then you have your greens, which are your kitchen waste. And most of the time all of us will have way more kitchen waste than we do the browns and the greens. So when you do traditional, it's browns, greens, and then you just let it sit outside, and it kind of decomposes. You have flies come, like they're called black soldier flies, and the maggots eat it, and the worms come in. It's just really kind of gross if you're not okay with gross, okay? So that is the traditional method, and that can take anywhere between 6 to 12 months before you can actually use it. So I've done it. I don't love it. You have to get in there, you got to turn it, and when you lift that and you turn it, you don't know what you're going to find under there. So if you get heebie-jeebies, don't do it. Now, then you have worm composting. Now, worm composting is exactly how it sounds, and you use worms to help digest and break through the same things faster. Now, worm composting could be 3 to 6 months. I think and it's not just any worm, it has to be the red wiggler worms, because any worm can eat, but the red wiggler worm apparently can eat its body weight every day. So it will go faster, because you have like one little mound of worms when you buy that is like 1,000 worms there. So it can go much faster. So in terms of being able to use it. And the other benefit of worm composting is then all of a sudden you have worm castings. So you'll see the product, you see compost, and you see worm casting. So both products are sold at nurseries, but you'll have both. Worm castings is basically just worm poop. And then that's what you use to make worm tea, which is probably another gardening term that you've heard tossed around. And then finally that comes around to, one last thing about the worm composting. There's worm towers that you can buy, but there's also something that I just recently got myself, and this is no endorsement, nothing. It's called the Sub Pod. Now this thing, it looks like a box with holes all over it for the worms to come in and out, and it has a lid on top, and that goes in the ground or in a raised bed. What I prefer about this is I've had the tower and I've forgotten about the tower because it's in the back somewhere, right? So I've forgotten to feed it. The moisture is going low. The worms aren't doing great. It's just like another pet. But with the sub pod, if you have forgotten, it's okay, because you have it in a raised bed. They can leave, they can come back, and you can actually grow around the sub pod. So then it's actually like integrated into your garden. Anyway, that's that product. You don't have to buy it. I just want you to have that information. Now, the last type of composting, I call it bokashi. So it's Bokashi. Now, this uses inoculated lactobacillus grains to help break that food waste down. So if you're mostly wanting to compost your food, you can try bokashi method, but you will need to then dump it into the ground or into some other place to let it finish. You're basically pickling your food waste, and then it returns down into the earth and so on and so forth. None of these are pretty. So composting is pretty gross. It's decomposing matter. And if done right, it's not supposed to smell. It might smell a little like pickles, a little like vinegar, but if it smells sour, throw that out because it's gone bad. And the one last thing I could say is if none of these sound very good to you, but you still worry about food waste, check out if you have a green bin outside for trash day. My green bin allows us to actually throw more things than I thought were allowed in there. And in my green bin, it says I can throw bones, I can throw food waste, I can throw coffee stuff. So read that. And because composting isn't for everybody, especially if you live in an apartment or something like that. So that's compost.
Thank you. Learned something new. I did not know about the green waste can. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Definitely the way to go if you're not sure yet and you still want to be, an eco warrior in your own right. Like, definitely the way to go.
Let's talk about spider mites. We've got some people with some spider mite problems, specifically one man in Pasadena who has an organic garden with tomatoes, green beans, peas, bell peppers. But at some point mid-harvest, the mites come in and take down the whole garden, and it happens year after year. What can he do besides either growing onions only, which seem to be spared, or quitting altogether?
So that's where I like to say you want to stay on the offense and not have to get to that point. And we go back to what I talked about with the soil. It's really important to have that good soil. And I actually didn't talk about it during the presentation, but when we talk about compost, I end up buying some compost. The compost that I like is Malibu compost. That's the name of it. And I top dress that. And I bring up compost because there's microbes in the compost that really benefit the plant. You can think of it kind of like when you take a probiotic and how it kind of makes you feel a little bit better, or a vitamin that maybe you weren't doing so great and you took your vitamin C and you feel a little bit better. That's kind of what compost can do for your plants. And when your plants are really healthy, they can fight off those spider mites and things like that. Now, sometimes it gets to that point in the season that's when summer is when all the bugs come and they all hit at the same time. So right before that, I think in about May to July is when I did my own spraying in my own yard. And I've only had to spray once, and I use a neem oil. It's NEEM. You don't need a lot, but you use neem oil and some Castile soap. Dr. Bronner's is another brand that many people in the gardening community use. And I particularly use the peppermint because bugs don't like peppermint for some reason. So I put the neem oil with the Castile soap and water. And there's a lot of different resources of like what ratio you can use. I don't have it memorized off the top of my head, but if you message me later, I can find that for you. You just foliar spray everything, and that usually keeps it from happening. I haven't had issues with spider mites myself because I do that. I haven't sprayed again since, actually, because when I'm a little bit lazy and I feel like sometimes survival of the fittest, but keeping your, like, for example, if it's tomatoes, you do need to prune them back so there's like good airflow. So that's another thing that if that didn't happen, do prune them back. If it's not producing fruit towards the bottom of the vine, prune it back so there's airflow and it keeps the spider mites and other pests from wanting to build their house there, basically. So that's a good one. And if you are dealing with like any insect worm type, then BT is another one. It's a really long scientific name for it, but both options are organic. They are found in naturally occurring in nature, so they're okay to use for an organic garden. The only thing I will say that if you are going to spray for anything, try to spray really early before the bees come around, or later in the evening before the bees come around, because they can be affected. Even though most of the time the labels will say they aren't affected, they still can be.
Let's switch away from spider mites and go to herbs. So Sherry apparently has a hard time growing her herbs and keeping them alive. We also had another person email me a couple days ago about something eating her basil, cilantro, and chives down to the root overnight. What do you recommend in terms of best practices for herbs?
So for herbs, it really depends on where you're growing them. Like, are they in a pot? Are they in like a raised bed? And what else are you planting around there? Because sometimes you can companion plant. I know you mentioned onions, right? So earlier. So the thing is, if you were to interplant, let's say like the bunching onions or the green onions that you get from the supermarket, and you just cut off the little ends, you can stick them in various different spots. Because here's the thing, you don't really want to spray because you're going to eat the actual leaf on these herbs, right? So what I like to do is I plant marigolds and I plant onions in between these plants to have a natural way of deterring these pests. I haven't had too many issues. The thing that might be mowing down all the herbs overnight, it's either a really hungry caterpillar or a slug. So the two things to look for for the caterpillar, you want to look for little things that, it's basically the caterpillar poop, but you look for little black pellets. And if you see little black pellets somewhere on the leaf, there's going to be a caterpillar somewhere. It might be underneath, it might be tucked away, but it's there. And then if you see kind of like slime or something shiny around the planter or the bed or on the plant, that's probably a slug. So you can find slugs easier at night because that's when they come out. But that's what I would look for.
Great. What about dry rot? We had someone who couldn't save their pumpkins. It sounds like they tried neem oil and reduced watering, but they weren't able to save their crop. How do you recommend saving a crop from dry rot?
Do you say dry what?
Rot, R-O-T.
So I haven't dealt with that myself, but that would sound like possibly overwatering or maybe putting something underneath. Yeah, I don't really know that one. I'll have to research, but let me think. I don't know if they mean blossom rot, because that could also be an imbalance of nutrients where it needs a bit more, I'm trying to remember which one it is, but there's a certain nutrient, I think it's like lime, that can, I think it's like dolomite lime that you can use to help prevent blossom rot, if that happens to be, I'm not sure if dry rot or versus blossom rot on that one.
We have a question about squash, so keeping in the squash family. Someone planted squash, a number of squash seeds, and 6 plants grew, but one grew so large that the other ones all stayed small and only 2 of the plants produced a few squash. Why do you think this happened?
Okay, so if it's all in the same bed, right? I want you to think of it like this. At your Thanksgiving dinner table, was somebody eating more? Okay, right? If that person's eating more, well, okay, that kind of, it gives you that sense of that particular plant just did really well. And kind of took over everybody else's share. They filled their plate, right? And they continued to filling their plate. Same thing in a raised bed. Now, to combat something like that, if the space is too small, you can't really fix that. The way to fix it would actually be to transplant it somewhere else and then to let it grow. But if it is a nutrient issue, then you can add more compost or more fertilizer so there's more food. I think what goes remiss a lot is when we plant something, we think we plant it and then we leave it and there's nothing else that we need to do. And sometimes we think it's only fertilizer, but that's not the case. And if you've ever gardened, you know that when you pot something, the soil starts to go down. Well, it's because it's being used up by the plant. And so you need more soil and more replenishing. So I think for that would be either move it so it has more space, basically move it to another table, right? So it has its own food, something like that.
Mookie has a vegetable garden for the summer. Mookie's in Northern California. It doesn't get a lot of sun in the winter, but it does in the summer. Do you think a container or pots would work if Mookie has them in a sunnier location in the winter? Not sure if that's enough growing room for winter veggies. So
yes, it all depends on what you want to grow. So I have plenty of friends who live in an apartment. I think a lot of LA is actually in an apartment, and you can grow quite a bit out of pots as long as the pot is large enough and you have the appropriate number of plants per pot. I've seen big tomatoes come out of pots. I've seen potted squash. So as long as it's winter appropriate in a sunny spot, yeah, you can definitely grow.
Let's go to some aphids. Let's talk about aphids. Someone has black aphids attacking their artichokes and their brassicas. This happened last season. Other than pulling the plants, is there a trick to manage black aphids?
There is. So I don't know if this has been done already, but if the plant is still there, because artichoke takes a long time, so the artichoke might still be there. What you would do first is at the beginning of the day, you would take not a high power hose, but a more forceful hose, not just a sprinkle, and just douse it and spray off, just basically knock the aphids off. Then you could use neem oil, that concoction that I was telling you about, the neem oil and the Castile soap, because then once the aphids, if they do come back, or the ones that you missed, take a bite, then they will perish and will not longer continue. And the other thing to do is actually the organic method is to go get some ladybugs, and the ladybugs will actually eat that. And other things to do are, again, plant marigolds and plant other ladybug attracting flowers to get them over and to eat that. Another thing is, I think the wasps, actually sometimes predatory wasps will eat aphids as well.
More reasons to save the bees.
Yes.
Okay. Susan said that she made her own do-it-yourself worm bin and loves the compost and compost tea she gets for them. She would love to hear your thoughts on permaculture. She recently converted a section of her lawn into an edible garden. For her zone, she planted pawpaw and native berries.
Yeah, so I think permaculture right now is a really, really hot, popular topic. And to me, permaculture is growing natively and also with the environment in mind of building that soil, which I kind of refer to a few times. And it's really important to, it's like another step beyond sustainability. And how do I describe it? It's like, that's a whole nother webinar too, but it's something that is getting romanticized a little bit too, because with it, just similar to composting, permaculture has an ugly side, a pretty side, and it's a lifestyle too. you know, and you can't just do permaculture a little bit. It is a full-on venture. And I can tell, like, you know, a lot of people who live in a not acres of land and we have an HOA or we live in an apartment, we can't really do permaculture. We can support others who do permaculture, but it's really challenging more if you don't have that space. But if you do, that's a great way to build your soil and, you know, grow the environment, things like that.
Someone's curious about your thought on using chicken poop as a universal fertilizer.
So chicken poop is great, except it is very acidic. So we didn't touch upon this in my presentation, but just like plants, there's plants that like more acidic soil and more basic soil. So things like blueberries and roses, camellias, azaleas, they like more acidic soil. So go ahead and use it. Chicken poop is great, except it's also very strong. And the best thing to do is not to immediately take it from, I'm guessing it's a coop, to go from a coop to plant. You would actually want to compost it and you want it to fully decompose because of all like how acidic it actually is. You can actually buy it also, but it's almost too rich by itself. So it's better to have it kind of mixed in and composted down.
Someone asked about, or Richard asked about rotating crops. I think we all kind of hear rotate crops so your soil doesn't get too tired and drained. But if you're replenishing the soil, do you still need to rotate those crops?
Yes, you do. Because there's only so much you can replenish, right? Like if you think about our bodies, if we only take a multivitamin, is that really enough? It's not, right? And so if we think about the garden in that same sense, then it can make sense of why we would want to not eat only one type of vegetable or do only one type of exercise. It's the very same concept for gardening as well. So there's a way to, you know, depending on what crop and what season, for example, tomatoes really leach everything out, while you have the peas and beans, they actually put more nutrients back in. And also when you turn your beds over, you don't have to take all the roots out. You can clip it right at the soil, and then the roots actually provide structure. And also as that decomposes in the bed, that's nutrients returning as well.
A couple people have asked about neem oil. For some, especially for some of us that haven't been gardening a lot, neem oil is a new term. What are some of the benefits of neem oil? Why is it used so frequently in gardening?
It's used frequently because it is organic, and there aren't too many organic options that actually truly work, I think. And also neem oil is derived from the neem tree. So it's basically already existing in nature, and some scientists has figured out how to bottle it for us to use in the garden. And I think neem oil is so popular because it works across so many different, like it's a solution, it's a blanket solution for a lot in the garden. It can, like for aphids, for caterpillars that you don't want eating your tomatoes, for example, for powdery mildew, it's a nice blanket as well. So I think that's probably why. Yeah.
So it looks like you might have some potential competition from April. April is interested in starting a similar consulting business where she helps set up raised beds, composting systems, and really help beginners get started. Does she need a business license or a contracting license to be a consultant? At what point do you have to kind of take it to that next level?
So that is a great question. And the answer would be to consult a lawyer in terms of what you can and cannot do. Because if push came to shove, you want that lawyer in your corner, just that as a preface, right? But in general, and I wouldn't see it as a competition, I would see it as a peer because, and I'm not just saying that, there are so many people who need to, who I think need to garden. And the more the merrier, because we all do different things. And what's really interesting for me is I've actually connected with a lot of garden consultants as well. And it's like a brand new niche industry almost. It's like fascinating to see that there are some who don't want to talk to you because you're doing something on the surface the same. But frankly, their client is not my client. Their client may not want to work with me. They don't like how I talk. They don't like how I teach, right? So with consulting, it's really interesting because anybody can just slap on a sticker and say, I'm a consultant because I know how to grow something, right? And that works. Now, if you want to go and build raised beds, it's okay until, and this is talking to my lawyer, but talk to yours first. If it's not a permanent structure, then that's kind of like the gray line between contractor versus non-contractor. Now, if you're going to be digging, like I think more than 1 or 2 inches, then that's another gray area of contractor versus non-contractor or landscaper. And we could go way deep into it, but you need like a C27 license and you need 3 years of working with a contractor to get that license and education behind that too. So, but yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That is all the time we have. We're just a minute or two before 5 o'clock. So thank you very much, Chia-Ming. It's so good to see you. And I do remember you from our college days. I wasn't sure if you remembered me,
No,
but
of course.
It's nice to see a familiar face. Everyone here, you do have her contact info. We're happy to share it again if you reach out. Jenna put the slide deck in the chat as well. You can go ahead and download it. We'll be on for a few more minutes if you'd like. For those of you attending the wine tasting on Thursday, looking forward to seeing you at the wine tasting. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next year, seeing you in January. So thank you all. Feel free to unmute, say hello, say goodbye. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks so much.